We are now recording. I probably should stop saying that at the beginning of those things because I think all the recordings will be like, we're now recording. But we'll cut right here. Welcome to Rethinking Christmas. So I'll share with you all more about my experiences of Christmas over the years to come. Some are funnier than others. But Christmas has been sort of a different thing for me. I was raised in a very traditional, American sort of Christianity Christmas where we still had a nativity scene set out, and we still went to church on Christmas Eve, and we still went to church on Advents, and still lit the candles and did all that. And when we also fully embraced the whole notion of Santa Claus and gift giving and trees and wreaths and cookies and all those sort of things. And like many Americans, our Christmas season really started probably sometime after Thanksgiving, and we started to put decorations up, and then over time, I didn't really think much about it. It just was what it was. And it was probably in my, I think it was in my, I guess it would have been in my late 20s. It was Judah was one of the things that sort of prompted it. I don't know how remember even how old he was. I guess if it was in early in seminary, he must have been like 2 or 3. But I remember him. I remember asking him something about Christmas, and he said something about getting gifts. And I was like, this is not going to be, so, and I started wrestling with the idea of it and whether we knew what we're going to do about Santa Claus. And we ended up not sharing telling about Santa Claus with either of our kids. And we ended up, sort of just letting it be a folklore and letting it exist in culture. But something happened in me in that seminary season of wrestling with what, as a new parent, I wanted, and Shannon and I wanted Christmas to be. And I remember I was joking yesterday or on Sunday when I said that, and somewhat that I wanted to not celebrate Christmas. I didn't want to not celebrate Christmas. I wanted to celebrate Christmas faithfully, I guess, in some ways. And it was like one of those things that I thought there's no way we can celebrate Christmas for being Christ's birth unless we shed ourselves of these gift giving rituals. And so I went on this rampage, and Shannon I remember it was a tense point in our marriage. She was freaking out, like, because she loves Christmas. And I was thinking, no, she was afraid she was going to have a husband who was going to be like, we're not having a tree. But I started reading. I read a couple of books on Christmas and the history of Christmas, not from a like a Jesus is the reason for the season sort of go back and recover Christmas, really just from what is Christmas, how does it function, how did it come to be. And at the same time, I was also taking a class called Missional Theology, which is about how we as Christians embrace a missional identity, meaning when we accept Christ as our Savior, our earthly identity is transformed into this sort of vision for God, and we've been given a mission and a goal to proclaim and live out God's kingdom values on this earth. Ultimately, the coincidence of this search for what we wanted Christmas to be and my aversion to Christmas and this class on missional theology led to this, a missional Christmas, a concise exploration of the missional dimensions of Christmas. And I won't read it because that would probably bore you, but I will pull a few quotes from it over the course of it. But I just get into sort of what the history of Christmas was. And as I dug in, what I discovered was there was a lot more to Christmas, both culturally and religiously or spiritually, than I expected on both sides. And it was really through the journey of this in seminary, writing this paper, that I actually sort of transformed my own thinking and understanding. And that led to our own family shaping of different rituals and practices within our own family, which we'll get into that stuff next week. But then I actually started teaching it. And over the last, but I wrote this in 2005, so 15 years ago. But over the last 15 years, I've probably taught it a dozen times in various locations and seminars and at conferences here and there and churches. So it's something that has always been kind of near and dear to me. But interestingly enough, I thought I would pull up my old paper, and I just read over it today just to kind of see what I said. I think it was worthy of its it's great. I'm just kidding. I don't remember what I got on it, no, but I as I read it, I was reminded of how important this holy day is, and we'll get into reasons why. But I think let's start with the question, and you don't have to answer. If you'd like to, you can. But start with the question for you all, and that is, what and not trying to look for spiritual answers, but when you think about the Christmas season, what are the emotions that are typically associated with it? That's not a rhetorical question.
Do I have enough money?
What?
Do I have enough money to buy all the gifts I want to buy for people?
Yes. Okay. So there is stress in gift giving and anxiety. And is this going to cost me a lot? What else?
Well,
you can say good stuff too. You don't have to say bad stuff. What else?
Well, Denny just said family being together, family gatherings.
Family being together. Yeah. Warm connections. It's colder typically in the North American region of the world and around December, and we all gather together at houses and light fires and have Christmas lights hanging up. So there's that sense of coziness and collectivity. What else?
I'm not crazy about Christmas lights, but they give you sort of a sense of wonder that kind of goes with the season, I think.
Yes. There is a sense of wonder. And I think that and I think there's a sense of mysticism that comes both from the idea of God incarnate, but also in the form of Jesus, but also in the idea of Santa Claus. There's mystery and the idea of someone flying all over the world delivering gifts to kids, and there's it is one of the more magical times of the year.
And in that respect, I would say it's a time of storytelling.
Absolutely. Folklore and story, and there's lots of stories from the traditional Saint Nick to our conventional Saint Nick to the wise men coming to the baby Jesus in a manger. Anything else?
A sense of expectation, looking forward to something, be it presents under the tree or the coming of the Christ child.
Yeah. Glenda, what were you going to say?
I always find myself just, I don't know, appalled or disgusted by how commercial it is. You turn on the TV, all it is advertising and pressure to shop and spend money and rescue American businesses in the final month of the year. And I don't know, I get disgusted and frustrated with what we have turned it into.
Yeah.
And I just want nothing to do. I can't stand going in stores in the month of December and you hear all the tinny secular Christmas, stupid Christmas music. I just want to turn away from all of that because I just find it all appalling.
Well, no, and I shared some of those sentiments now, and I still do. And I mean, I think, even at like Black Friday, I mean, it's like we can't even, you get Christmas decorations before Thanksgiving, and Black Friday. I mean, the stories that we've seen over the last 2 decades of every time there's always in some, Target or Walmart, there's always like someone getting trampled over getting the next, whatever American Doll, model is, or the newest PlayStation. So there's the dark side of it, and there's lots of good things in it. And I think, and on the other side of that, there's also this notion in American Christianity that somehow Jesus is the reason for the season, and we have to embrace that and hold on to that. And in doing so, we honor Christ in that. So that's kind of what I want to look at. I mean, I think for me, there was a point where, and I'm much more gracious in my approach now, but like if people started putting up Christmas lights before Thanksgiving, I thought, good heavens. But I understand, and I think before it was kind of like, just let each season be season. But for many Americans, the holiday season really starts from that that Wednesday before Thanksgiving, and it goes all the way till December or until January 2nd. That is the holiday season. That is the Christmas season. That's the New Year's season. That's kind of, and so you can have, you can, and anything goes sort of in between those. And obviously we can push the boundaries every which direction. I don't want to see Halloween decorations up in August, and I don't want to see Christmas decorations up in October, but at the same time, everyone can do what they want to do. So, but at the same time, we're also like, hey, what does it mean as a cultural celebration to embrace these during a certain season? No doubt that it brings out a sense of nostalgia and peace. No doubt that it brings out that sense of this is what it ought to be. And I think a guy named Richard Horsley wrote this paragraph, and for me, I remember it capturing the sense of what we imagine Christmas to be. The Christmas season is offers a Yuletide in which people greet their fellows warmly in a seasonal harbor from an otherwise cold society. A light-filled and entertaining respite from the gray of winter, the time when we are given gifts and when values are realigned into their proper chain of being, with family and friendships taking their proper place at the top of our lives' hierarchy. These are wholesome, deeply resonant symbols of values we hold dearly and of a world which we yearn. And I think at Christmas at its best, it captures this idealism. The season of Christmas captures the idealism of what we really want life to be. Some people just love to live in Christmas all year round. Not necessarily even for the gift giving, just for the feeling of closeness and connection. And there's the darkness and the coziness, and it just sort of feeds into this sentiment of warmth and love. And we experience in that. But the reality is, and many of you are probably past those stages of that stage in life where you're like, oh, I got to buy all my kids gifts, and I got, and you have grandkids now that you feel that pressure for, which is probably a lot easier. But that stage where parents are like, how am I going to bridge the gap between what I'm supposed to expectedly buy my children for Christmas and everyone else for Christmas? Kind of like you said, do I have enough money to cover all of this? But the idea is sort of, we want to have this sense of a perfect Christmas. And then in that ideal, there's this idea of Jesus is the reason for the season, right? And I'm not here to debunk that notion that Jesus is the reason for the season. I think in our culture, Jesus is part of the reason for the season. And I think because of the way our history has around this holiday been intertwined with culture and outside influences, we've shifted that understanding. But the question becomes, for many Christians, how can I rescue this consumer-driven holiday and recover it for some sense of spirituality? Now, how do we do that? Well, most Americans go to church on Christmas Eve, right? I mean, this is kind of one of if you're in a Christian sort of background, it's 2 times a year, Easter and Christmas Eve. Those are the 2 times you have to go, even if you don't go regularly. So there's a sense of acknowledging Christ's birth through this 1 or 2 times a year sort of visit. Sometimes people do it a little more, and they say, okay, let's do Advent. We'll do Advent devotions, or and they try to infuse the period leading up to Christmas with some sense of devotion, spirituality, and waiting. But more often than not, the vast majority of Americans, whether they're devout Christians or marginally Christian, will still have some acknowledgement of this idea of Jesus as being the center of this holiday. And they do so by the image of baby Jesus in a manger. It's cute. We love baby Jesus in a manger. He's a little cute figure. No matter what nativity set, baby Jesus is always cute, because that would be rude to make an ugly baby Jesus in a manger. But there's, and then we put up light displays. And I remember, I can't tell you how many in Louisville we always drive around, look at Christmas lights. It'll be a short trip here this year, but it's one of our activities. We always like to drive around town, look at the Christmas lights. The amount of lit plastic form manger scenes that have some formation of Jesus and the wise men and some shepherds and sheep are plentiful out there. They're all over the place. My favorite, and I don't know if you've ever seen the meme, I'll probably share it at some point this year, but there's one where it's like baby Jesus and Mary and Joseph, and then baby Jesus in the middle, but it looks like two T-Rex heads, like Tyrannosaurus heads. Have you seen this? I'll have to get this. It's fantastic. It's the silhouette, and it looks like two Tyrannosaurus Rexes like this. Oh, and there's a little baby Jesus down there in the middle. So those are the best because people put them up, and then once you see it, you can't unsee it. It's like horror movies. That's why I don't watch them. But now, if you have a silhouetted Jesus or something, I always think that looks like a T-Rex. But we've tried as a culture to grab this idea of baby Jesus, and we don't want to miss. And as Christians, we don't want to miss. We don't want to like just put Jesus to the side because there's a fear that somehow we're dishonoring this holy day if we do so. But the question becomes: do our efforts actually honor the majesty of what Christmas is meant to represent, which is God's ultimate transcendence into this world, God's ultimate act of love, of not only coming to die, but just coming to be human, to be boundless, and to be placed into a state of boundness, to be infinite and to placed into a space of finiteness, or to be immortal and to be placed in a space of mortality. Like that, just that sacrifice of shedding of one's divine nature and becoming human. Do we honor the majesty of that divine act of God, that transcendence of God, well in our conceptions of baby Jesus in a manger? That is a rhetorical question. And with that in mind, I want to show you what I think is one of the, and I was going to show you a snow globe. And if you look on Amazon, you type in Jesus loves you so much, you'll see it. And there's a snow globe on there. It's got a little snowman. I don't know what a snowman has to do with Jesus, because not every country in the world has snow anyways. So, but let me show you what I think is, where is it here? I'm going to share my screen with you, and come on, hold on 1 second. Let me pull it up here. Make sure I have it. Copy and paste and share. All right, we might have to watch a commercial here. Let me see if it'll go. Tell me if you can hear it or if you can't hear it. Can you all hear that?
Nope.
No.
You can't hear any of that?
No.
Let me see here. It's not going to work maybe then. How about that?
No.
No.
No? One more time.
It's loading.
It's not even playing?
No.
All right, then I'll stop sharing. I wish I could show you. I don't know why it doesn't play through. I'll send you a link and get it to you, or I'll put it on somewhere. But I don't know if you've ever seen the movie Talladega Nights. Have you ever seen this movie? No? Well, it's with Will Ferrell, and he is a race car NASCAR driver, and it's at dinner, and he's praying to baby Jesus. He's invited to say the prayer for the meal, and he just won a race, and it's all about, oh, sweet baby Jesus, 8 pounds 2 ounces, wrapped up in a little cloth with your balled up little hands, and it's just this personification of am I disappointing you now that you can't see it? Hold on here a second. Sweet baby Jesus. It's worth playing. Here, I'll do it on my phone and hold it up to you. All right, here we go. It's not the way I wanted to show it to you, but it'll have to do.
Dear Lord, baby Jesus, or as our brothers to the south call you, Jesus, we thank you so much for this bountiful harvest of Domino's, KFC, and the always delicious Taco Bell.
You hear that?
I would say thank you for my family, my 2 beautiful, handsome, striking sons, Walker and Texas Ranger, or TR, as we call him. And of course, my red hot smoking wife, Carly, who's a stone cold fox. who, if you were to rate her ass on 100, it would easily be a 94.
Sorry
I
about
also
that.
want to thank you for my best friend and teammate, Cal Nunn, who's got my back no matter what.
Shake and bake.
Dear Lord Baby Jesus, we also thank you for my wife's father, Chip. We hope that you can use your baby Jesus powers to heal him and his horrible leg. And it smells terrible, and the dogs are always bothering with it. Dear tiny infant Jesus.
Hey, sweetie,
There it is.
Jesus did grow up. You don't always have to call him baby. It's a bit odd and off-putting to pray to a baby.
Well, look, I like the Christmas Jesus best, and I'm saying grace. When you say grace, you can say it to grown-up Jesus or teenage Jesus or bearded Jesus or whoever you want.
You know what I want? I want you to do this grace good so that God will let us win tomorrow.
Dear tiny Jesus, your golden fleece diapers with your tiny little fat balled up fist
He
pawing.
was a man. He had a beard.
Look, I like the baby version the best. Do you hear me? I win the races and I get the money.
Ricky, finish the damn grace.
I like to picture Jesus in a tuxedo T-shirt because it says like, I want to be formal, but I'm here to party too. Because I like to party, so I like my Jesus to party.
I like to picture Jesus as a ninja fighting off evil samurai.
I like to think of Jesus like with giant eagle's wings and singing lead vocals for Leonard Skinner with like an angel band. And I'm in the front row and I'm hammered drunk.
Hey, Cal, why don't you just shut up?
Yes, ma'am.
So for me, it's a great scene. And they cut it off right at the most important part where he's like, and he finally does it. He's like, sweet 8-pound, 5-ounce, sweet,
What's that bit
Oh,
sweet quiz?
Oh, it started already. It started up again. But this is what American Christianity has done to Christmas. We've turned the idea of Christmas and honoring Jesus' birth into this notion of a sweet baby Jesus. And that really is kind of what I want to wrestle with. And in order to do so, I want to do a couple things. One, I want to look at just the history of Christmas. But before I do that, I want to debunk some basic myths about Christmas. One, Jesus being born on December 25th. As you'll find out, it has nothing to do with the date. And actually, historians will say Jesus was probably born in the summer months because the shepherds out with their flocks at night is probably not, we're probably not in the dead of winter. Now, that doesn't really make a difference because we commemorate a lot of things in life over various dates. And as long as we observe those, we're observing the actual sense of what happened before in a date. In other words, we have no historical accuracy for the time. So it really doesn't make a difference, but it's where it landed. And I'll give you a few reasons why. Two, as you probably know, and I know that I've heard that Ed has mentioned this before, the wise men didn't come for a year later. So every nativity set that we have is wrong. So we have a sweet baby Jesus. We have 3 wise men that were not there. When they got there, baby Jesus was already one wearing his golden fleece diapers. Because when the star came up and they came from the east on camels, well, it's quite a journey and it takes some time to get there. So and really we'll talk about this when it comes time for Epiphany. Epiphany is a very important holiday, as it should be for Gentiles, because it's the day that the Gentile world acknowledged the kingship and lordship of Jesus Christ. They came to make this honor to Jesus for who he was. 3, oftentimes we'll see that people will say, oh, when it's about Christ, Christmas is about Christ, and when you put an X in front of Mass and you get Xmas, that somehow it's an attempt to take Jesus out of Christmas. Now, I think you could argue this either way, but the reality is the X or the chi has been a common symbol for Jesus because it's the first letter of his name, the C. And so for a long time, that sense of X was really a shorthand for writing Christ. So historically, when Xmas started happening or started using it, it wasn't an attempt to cross out Jesus's name as a Christ. And really, Christ was a title. It wasn't even his name. It was like Jesus the Christ or Jesus the Messiah. And so it's really not meant, although, and it's dangerous to interpret it that way in culture. In other words, there's hostility between Christians and culture around that, and it doesn't need to be. 3 or 4, the myth that we give gifts in our culture, as you'll see as we go through the history of it, that we don't give gifts because of Jesus, and God giving us the greatest gifts in Jesus. We don't give gifts because the wise men gave gifts, although I think that's a closer parallel. We give gifts because of a historical precedent for giving around the season that we're going to explore, and something that has developed really only over the last about 100 years. So most of our gift giving and Christmas and holiday rituals are actually given to us by the last 100 years, not by anything that even remotely dates back to Christ. And last, and Denny and I were just talking about this last week, the notion of saying happy holidays is not robbing Jesus of any glory, because really the notion of holiday is meant to mean holy day. And Christmas is inherently, although an American holiday, it is inherently a Christian holiday. And, Denny and I were talking about how, sometimes, if you celebrate Kwanzaa or Hanukkah or what else would be in Christmas time? I don't even know. What else is the other one? There's another one. But that idea that we are all celebrating different things at this different seasons and so that sense of holiday or holy day, when it's used in our culture, is not meant to say, hey, we're taking Jesus out of the season, but in a sense to say these are holy days and we all come from different perspectives and backgrounds. And honestly, and to some extent, if you take the way American Christianity celebrates Christmas, it's not surprising that we should actually maybe pause and consider how we celebrate it ourselves before we actually say, hey, let's take Christ out of it. But the question that remains is, is Christmas really about Christ? And the only way to really explore is Christmas about Christ is to go back in history, even prior to Christ's time. Now, if you look at the world and in terms of a strip around it, we sort of are in the same or similar geographic longitude as Europe. And so we have a similar sort of growing patterns. We're sort of, in similar regions in the sense what we are colder in the winter and warmer in the summer months. And Christmas, as we understood it, so this is prior to Christ, there was no such thing as Christmas, prior to Christ ever being born. What was happening in Europe and around the time was that in that agrarian belt where everyone grew vegetables for their living, and they had cattle, and they spent all summer tending those fields and their flocks and their cattle, and then the winter and then the fall came, and they brought all their harvest in and dried their stuff and preserved their food for the winter. Because again, they didn't have refrigeration back then. They didn't have other means that they had to prepare for the long winter months where they would have to survive. Well, a number of things happened around the month of November leading into the month of December. One, there was no more work to do. So you have to imagine, let's put America into this context. Let's say we're all agrarian society. Well, November comes around, all the crops are harvested, it's getting cold, the frost has set in, we can't do anything in the field anymore, it has to lie fallow. Now all of a sudden we have some cold weather, so now we can consider slaughtering some cattle so we can have meat during the winter, and that happened in late November, early December. So no one's working, all the food has been harvested. Now there is all of a sudden a lot of meat to eat because you're slaughtering the animals, and all of the beer that was made and the wine that was made was now at a place where it was slightly fermented and ready to drink. And it was dark. So everyone went to bed and went inside and lit candles and light, and there was a sort of celebration moving into the darkness. But what you have is no one working and a lot of people having a lot to eat and drink. And all of a sudden you have a season, or maybe not all of a sudden, but over a period, you have a season that develops in the month of December as really being a party month. Like it was like, eat all the meat you want, drink all the stuff that's been out there. And so this drinking and eating and celebration and merrymaking personified the entire season of solstice, which fell around when the darkest night of the summer or of the winter comes, and then it turns to light. So there was both a celebration of the onset of this darkness and then a celebration of light that moved out of that. And that's throughout. And so we get a lot of our rituals from that. Yule logs, Christmas trees, lighting lights, those sort of merry-making, cozy sort of things come from prior to Christ's time, where we have these rituals that are really meant to bring back light or to summon the light back. Now, what happened was not only was and in fact, I have a quote here for you. No, I don't. I'm gonna read that one. All of these things led to binging, gluttony, perpetual drunkenness, and actually many historians say a lot of sexual immorality, because it was a time where, again, no one had any work, lots of food, lots of drink, lots of things. But something happened then in the 4th century. And what happened was the Emperor Constantine came on the scene, and we've talked about this, and being reformed, and basically Christianized all of Europe. And all of a sudden, in this Christianization of Europe, where everyone was all of a sudden being converted, there was this sense of what are we going to do with this time of debauchery that exists in the kingdom? And in fact, Richard Horsley also said, and I think it's a great quote, as the Roman Empire was being Christianized, church leaders placed a thin veneer over their traditional pagan celebration around the time of winter solstice. While there was no absolute scriptural basis for celebrating the birth of Jesus, this proved a convenient vehicle for which the church could appropriate such a deeply entrenched pagan holiday. In other words, the reason we have Christmas at December 25th is because the Emperor Constantine wanted to try to put a control on the debauchery that he saw happening in the Roman Empire around the season. And by doing so, since everyone was Christian, if you made it about Christ's birth, then it would theoretically pull people back to a more spiritual and calm and disciplined life reflection around the time. And let me pause there and ask if you have any questions. No? You're all good? All right. And here's the interesting thing about it. This sort of behavior carried on even after that. And there was, other than sort of an institutionalization of trying to implement some sense of holiness around the season, this sense of sort of debauchery that happened around this Christmas season carried on, and to the point where it was through the Middle Ages and all the way even into the 16th century. And to the extent that the 16th century bishop Hugh Latimer, not like you care about his name, said, men dishonor Christ more in the 12 days of Christmas than in all the 12 months besides. So that means a mere 400 years ago, there was a bishop saying Christmas was a mockery to who Christ was, and there was more dishonor to who Christ was. So when we trace back Christmas over the last 2,000 years, that means really, honestly, 1,900 years of it or so that we know about, that we really have details on, and really pointed to a sense of not celebrating our understanding of Jesus being the reason the season for it in itself. That significance of the incarnation was largely ignored. And that continued on into the puritanical period, where the Puritans came over in the early colonial period in the US. And actually early Puritans wouldn't even celebrate Christmas because they thought it was, was wrong. And they, not only about the dating side of it, but about the behavior that was going on. And they completely rejected it as a whole. But something happened as it came over in those 400 years after the 16th century, as we established this nation, as we came over and there were rich here and there were poor here, and there were immigrants who came over with money and immigrants who came over with nothing. And as folks established themselves, we started to see a similar debauchery, but in a more organized North American understanding of what historians would call social inversion. Meaning that it was around the time of Christmas that giving became normalized over the last 400 years, but it was normally not the wealthy giving to the poor by their own choice, but it was by a force of social inversion. So around this time, you had a lot of, quite frankly, you had a lot of social inversion sexually and gender roles. So you had men dressing like women and women dressing like men. You had older folks who were listening to younger folks, and there's records of the young people being sort of put up on in festivals like they're the bishops, and the bishops are now lowly. And so it was this entire reversal of societal structures for this season of Christmas. And interestingly enough, it came in form of two ways that it came sort of about in the 17th and 18th century. One, mumming. When mumming is defined as a temporary cross-dressing for the purposes of merrymaking incognito with neighbors. And so there was a sense of a social inversion for the purposes of, or masking oneself as something else for the purposes of merrymaking, because you're getting yourself in trouble. Now, Halloween participates in this a little bit as well, in the sense of you put on a mask and a costume to hide your own behavior. So that trick-or-treating actually taps also into another Christmas tradition that we find its early understanding of. Anyone want to know what that is? Anyone want to guess? Vossling. You know what vossling is?
Yeah,
Nope.
Historic caroling.
yeah.
So we go house to house, we gather together in our locations, and we go take our songbooks and we go knock on a door, and someone answers and we sing to them Christmas carols. And sometimes we even have a little bucket for donations for charity or something like that. But oftentimes we're just doing it for merrymaking. Well, that's not how it began. And actually the whole notion of this social inversion is what drove that sense of vossling. And you see it in the words of "We wish you a Merry Christmas." Vossling was when the poor went and stood in front of the rich mansions and they sang in drunken stupor. Remember all the partying going on. And basically they said, either give us some of the wealth that you have stored up, some of your figgy pudding, some of your riches, some of your gifts, some of your, all the things that you have that we don't, you're going to give us some, or we won't leave until we get some. So those words in the song, "We wish you a Merry Christmas," now give us some figgy pudding, we won't leave until we get some. That's not a polite way of asking for someone for a Christmas treat. That's saying, if you don't give us some of the things that you have that you are benefited by, we're going to mess you up. And there are historical counts over the last 500 years of landowners getting beat up and their houses getting raided because they weren't respectful of that social inversion. And so it became a time of drunkenness and partying where the poor went to the rich and told them, we want something from you, and the rich had to give it to them. And that carried on all through the last few hundred years up to really the 20th century. And let me pause there for any questions.
Can I make an ask? Is this
Yeah.
something that happened more in the cities and the heavily populated areas? Because I'll be honest with you, that's not at all the way our family kind of looked at Christmas, because we're more from a farmer background and the farmers and hunters, and we looked at that holiday season, starting with Thanksgiving, as giving thanks for the harvest, for doing well with our farms, and then Christmas was the sign of new beginnings. And you shared your wealth from your farms and harvest with your friends in a good way. You felt good about doing that, and you're preparing for a new year. And Jesus was the symbol of a new beginning, as opposed to kind of what you're saying. So,
Well,
I mean, this is from a farmer point of view.
From what century, Denny? I mean,
It was carried
are you
on in my
speaking on
family, it
behalf
was
of the
carried
last
on from my
100 years?
grandparents and from their time, you know.
So
It
in the
was a
last
family
100 years.
thing. It was something brought up.
Well, so it's interesting that you say that, because in the last 100 years, it's changed. Okay. So
Fashioned.
well, it is, what's that?
I said we were kind of old fashioned and we weren't from the big cities.
Well, no, and it doesn't. I think in general, what happened was, and I don't know what years you're talking about or how far your collective family memory goes back, but really in the first part of the last century, we see a big shift in this, and that's what, and which is where we go in the early part of the last century. So sort of what the Knickerbocker family. There's a whole examination of how the Knickerbockers basically reshaped Christmas in the last century, and for the American mindset of what Christianity is. And I'll read again a quote from you. It says, the Knickerbockers sought to transfer Christmas merrymaking from the public realm, meaning, you know, merrymaking outside in the public realm, and the gift and the forced giving, to the domestic sphere. In the process, transforming holiday treating from a class-based demand of gifts from elite to a family-centered giving of gifts from parents to children. So in other words, over the last century, the Knickerbockers and other elites in New York decided they wanted to put an end to the merrymaking as well, in part, and because they were the elite, and there was an expectation, and there was a shift then from giving from the rich to the poor, and they've taken that and they domesticated it, and it became the parents giving to the children. And really, prior to sort of the 70s and 80s, most of the gift giving was meant to come from someone who was in an authority position or parental or, an adult position to a children's position. And that was all wrapped up in this idea. What the Knickerbockers did was to take the idea of St. Nicholas or St. Nick from Holland or from Dutch background, and the folklore that comes around the historical figure St. Nicholas, and they put another veneer on it in the idea of the garden variety Santa Claus. Much like we often say, well, we have actually, Denny, I'm looking at you thinking you're kind of the prototype of Santa Claus with a big beard and jolly and laughs. He's even laughing. And it's kind of like the garden variety Buddha. Everyone sort of sees Buddha as this guy with a big belly and a bald head and sort of sitting like this. That's actually not what Buddha looks like. Buddha was a very thin man. And in the same way, Saint Nick was a very thin, tall man who was of noble descent and was generous in a number of things. And we'll look at Saint Nick in a few weeks when but there was a sense that there was a shift from how we conceptualize this gift giving. And then it shifted not only from parents to children, but then as that folklore began to take root, the shift went from not necessarily parents to children, but from this mythological figure this figure of Santa Claus, as we understand him, gift giving to children. And it really wasn't even the nigger. I don't think they even had any intention of it spinning out of control in the way it did, but it just so happens that all of those came about through the last century during a time when marketing and industrialization and manufacturing sort of started to really ramp up in a way that made and moving to a point where it was globalized. We can get gifts from around the world. And then the economic side of this, in terms of giving birth to a spending glut. And if you want to jump ahead another 50 years, where we are today, marketing consumering has taken this gift giving, and it's not even a sense of just parents giving to children or those who have giving to those who have not, which is still captured in the notion of the Salvation Red or the what is it? Salvation Army Red, the jingle of the bucket we sort of give. Christmas is also a time for big generous giving and charitable giving, because that still taps into it. But what marketing has done is now shifted that. And it's not just rich giving to poor or older giving to younger. It's everybody giving to everybody. And it's no longer just giving, but it's looked at as, now we use the word, we're going to a gift exchange. And we've moved from a place of benevolence and charity and giving out of love to a place of giving with an obligatory sense of what we ought to give, or if we don't give, that it's going to, that we need to give in order to receive. And that sense of whenever we give and then there's an expect of an exchange and come back, then there all of a sudden that very notion of the giving, of the grace of giving, the giving with no expectation in return, becomes a barter, a socially custom sanctioned bartering of gifts. And then we have put that on our children to the extent, again, going back to the story at the beginning, where Judah's big concern was what he was going to get for Christmas, not is there something greater here that needs to be, that Christmas is about, or this season is about as a whole. Okay, I'm going to stop there because we have 15. I have more to say, but I'm going to say where I hopefully I haven't totally destroyed your conception of Christmas, because I do think there's redemption in this, and I love celebrating all things about Christmas, just to keep in mind. So what are you thinking?
Are you going to have a tree?
Yes, we have trees and we make cookies and we celebrate Saint Nick and we sing carols and we do stockings and we do all of those. And we're going to get to what that looks like.
I'm happy for Shannon then.
Yes, over the years I've designed a little board game around the theme of Santa Claus. It's so much.
Well,
that's
of course
how
you
love,
Of course.
Of course.
which we'll play eventually. But I guess my question though is that So from when I wrestle with the idea of, is Jesus the reason for the season? What I hope to communicate to you in the last half an hour is that Jesus was never the reason for much of the cultural celebrations that we embrace around Christmas. That doesn't make the cultural celebrations bad. And I think that's the first point that I really want to make. Just because the cultural celebrations that we have predate Jesus and come from sordid backgrounds and come from folks manipulating society as a whole, it doesn't necessarily make them bad. And in fact,
we can,
what's that?
They're not
We can do
mutually
both.
exclusive. We can do both.
Yes. The problem is we have tried to conflate the two into one thing. And so we take gift giving and we say, oh, it's about Jesus being God's gift to us, or about the Magi giving gift. And we take a tree and we put lights on it. We say, oh, it's about the light of Christ or the saints that were there. Or we take a wreath and we put, in other words, we try to Christianize symbols of a holiday or a holy season or a set apart season of time in the history of humanity, or at least in Western humanity. And when we try to make it Christian, we both lessen to some extent or devalue the cultural value of some of those traditions that we celebrate, and we reduce the incarnation to a baby Jesus in a manger. That's cute.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. So then the question is, does Christmas matter as a cultural celebration? I mean, it matters to us as a cultural celebration. All the warm, fuzzy feelings, all the good food, all the singing of the carols, all the lights. I love it all. But those are cultural celebrations, and there's nothing wrong with them. I just want to make that very clear. I'm not downing on any cultural celebration whatsoever. I do think materialism has overtaken Christmas, and that's a separate issue. But all the things that make the holiday season or the holy season feel cozy and wonderful and family and celebration of food, those are all wonderful things, and those are part of the rhythm of life that we ought to celebrate. It is a season that we're meant to slow down, and we're meant to be reminded of the things that matter. In the same way, historically, for thousands of years, that has been part of what it is. I'm not sure everyone was out, drinking and partying and carrying on. I think there's a lot of sense of who are we? This is a time for us to be together and to spend time together. So does it need to matter for us spiritually?
Does it need to matter? I think it does.
Does it need to matter for us spiritually?
I think we can do both, as you said. I think it does matter.
Yes, I think I would agree with you. But I would say it doesn't matter because Christmas is necessarily when Jesus' actual birth was. It doesn't matter there because it falls into line with all the cozy feelings of cultural celebration. It matters because for the last 1700 years, for the identity of Gentile, in particular Gentile Christians, Christmas is where we commemorate not necessarily the birth of Christ, but God's incarnation in the form of a human being. In other words, we're not meant to necessarily abandon the holiday, but we're meant to claim it for Christ's sake in some way. Other traditions, Orthodox tradition, I don't know, you maybe have heard me say this before, Orthodox folks, Epiphany, incarnation is a huge thing. Like, and in fact, it affects their theology in the sense of when they think when Jesus became human, that there was a sense of divine union with humanity and with God, and that we will someday, in some sense, participation in this deification of this transformation, and we will be made like Christ in that regard. And we as Protestants believe that to some extent as well. But there's a strong emphasis on the incarnation. Now, the Roman Catholics typically have a stronger emphasis of the incarnation, the crucifixion, and the resurrection. Roman Catholics focus on the crucifixion, the penance, the death, and that sense of, and which is why you go into any Roman Catholic church, you still see Jesus on the cross. And if you go into a Protestant church, we focus on the resurrection, which is why you go into a Protestant church and you don't see Jesus on the cross. You just see an empty cross. It's meant to remind us of the death, but that Jesus no longer lives there, that Jesus is resurrected at the right hand of the Father. So, but for a long time in church history, then, that sense of that incarnation still carried weight. And we, in many sense, have lost that sense of mystery around the idea of the divine coming human. Make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So then the question becomes, if Christmas is not about baby Jesus in a manger, and Christmas is not about the three wise men and the gift giving that we do, the question becomes, how then do we honor the incarnation in our religious or spiritual or faith-based rituals and celebrations and activities? You know, even in session this morning, we talked about decorating the church. That's a cultural celebration. There's nothing that I love decorating. We drive around. I'm all about the decorating. So don't think of me a bah humbug, but there's nothing about the decoration of a church that honors Jesus.
Why not? Because we transform those symbols of light and the evergreen, and especially the wreath. I have been told that the wreath was a symbol used by early Christians already, who would put laurel wreaths on their doors as a sign of victory.
Perhaps. I think a lot, I can't trace every ritual, but I know that every ritual typically goes back to some secular or pagan observance that was somehow Christianized or a veneer put on, as Horsley said. So, I guess my question for you, Glenda, is why? Why does a Christmas tree have to represent anything of Jesus? Why can't it just be a festival of something, a celebration of the fun of the season? Why do we feel the need to take these things that are important to our cultural identity and celebration around this season of the year and make them Christian?
Well, isn't it our role to make everything Christian?
To Christianize everything?
Isn't that how we're supposed to live our lives?
Well, I think we're always supposed to live our lives in demonstrating Christ's love.
Everything we do?
To transform all of the rituals that we do in our world around and interpret them through Christ?
Not necessarily literal transformation to, the symbol exactly literally means it, but shouldn't we be expressing somehow our recognition of God in everything? This world,
and
everything in it belongs to Him.
And I'm not disagreeing with any of that, save for the fact that that what compels us to the need to transform our cultural Christmas season rituals into spiritual reflections. We don't do that with a lot of the other things of the year.
Yeah. Well,
why don't we transform Valentine's Day into God's love for us?
Well, again, I think Christmas is symbolic, as he was a new baby and he was a new beginning, and it's symbolic of his new life is also our new life. Because of him, we now have life, and it's a symbol each year. It's kind of something that it's symbolic of going into the next year with a good feeling.
But
yes,
isn't the incarnation an enormous event? I know it's not the end of the story, it's really the beginning, or once
the middle.
It's event in the story. As we've been studying in the Bible study, this is a very long story that starts with the beginning of humanity, and this was like a major event when Christ became incarnate, and as you said earlier, he sacrificed his divinity to come to this earth. And in that, I know you don't want to emphasize just this charming little baby, but that was a huge sacrifice on his part to give up his power, his authority, his role in heaven, and come and humble himself in that way. I think that's a big event to celebrate.
Absolutely. And I think we need to celebrate.
Say, well, it's not important, and we can just have normal Christmas festivities.
And I guess what I'm saying is that it is so important that it ought to stand on its own.
Yeah.
And the amazing thing about it, in all the social inversion we're talking about, over 2,000 years of social inversion, that Christ's incarnation was the ultimate divine inversion of God becoming human and God coming in the form of a baby. And Jesus, for the entire life of his 33 years of existence on this earth, was constantly inverting those social structures that empowered those in power and disempowered those who were not. And Christ flipped that and hung out with the sinners, and hung out with the prostitutes and the tax collectors, and went and saw the adulterers, and told the rich man to go sell all his possessions, and cast this very different vision of what it meant to live in this world. And he did it through experiencing the very mortality, the very finite nature of who we are as humanity. And I think that the incarnation is such a significant event that I guess the ultimate argument that I'm saying is we ought to stop half celebrating the incarnation through cultural symbols of, and I'm not saying we can't use baby Jesus in a manger, because I think there's a humility inherent there that we need to embrace. But sometimes we just think just because there's a baby Jesus in a manger sitting on our end table, or hanging on our tree as an ornament, that somehow we've captured the essence of who Christ is at Christmas. And whereas the majesty of what follows the incarnation is the whole reason we're even having this discussion to begin with. And I guess at the end of the day, next week we're going to look at it more explicitly, how we might actually, the practicalities of how we might approach this season. But I guess as we close out this session, what I really want to press on you is I'm not against any Christmas celebration. Christmas celebrations are grand. Yuletide, all of it, just put it all into play. I'm not against, gift giving, all those sort of things. Those are all great things. I think it's gotten a little out of hand, but I think those cultural celebrations ought to be given the respect they deserve to exist on their own without having a Christianized version of it put on for the sake of our own consciences.
Well, could those be relegated to New Year's celebrations or something like that? But let Advent and Christmas be focused on
Jesus.
On Jesus, right.
And I don't even think and I'll give you a little tease for next week. I think part of the answer is, and this is going to be a challenge because we're doing this year, but we'll talk about it every year. What does it mean to embrace the Advent season as the Advent season, a season of waiting? And it doesn't mean you can't have all these cultural celebrations. And that's the reason I think that Advent gets a bad rap in the church, because it feels like Advent is in conflict with cultural celebrations, which we associate with Christmas. And I think we have cultural celebrations that exist in December, that during the season that we've centered around Christmas, that can exist on their own, but that the celebrations that we have around, or the observance that we have around Advent, really takes us all the way up to Christmas Eve. And then we celebrate Christ's birth. And then we have 12 days in which goes back 1,700 years. And yet for so many Americans and Christian Americans, the minute December 26th rolls around, we're pulling out receipts to return gifts and taking out the trash and wondering what our credit card statements are going to be looking like next year. And that day is meant to be the second day of Christmas, where we live into this celebration, where we have 12 days where we're supposed to be able to say, let's have this be a feast time. Let's celebrate 12 great meals. Let's get together with 12 different groups of friends, not this year. I don't care, give gifts during those 12 days. My point in saying that is culturally, we've been given a 12-day season to celebrate everything that is joyous about Christ and about our new life and everything that you all have said. And then it comes to a crescendo in the holy day of Epiphany, where we remember the three magi coming on January 6th. And on that day, we're meant to, and we'll talk about this next week, that's where it's meant to, you're supposed to take down all the Christmas stuff, and you begin a new year from that Epiphany forward. And that's just a little teaser for next week, if you actually decide to come back for part 2.
Definitely coming back.
All right, so how did that sit with you all? Okay, if you're squirming a little, that's good. I like to have you squirm just a smidge. So
I was saying, you're a mean one, Mr. Grinch.
You're a mean one, Mr. Grinch. No, I love Christmas. I love the all of the season, and it goes back to, again, I guess, Denny, the conversation we were having is that this is a holiday season because it is a holy season, not because it is perfect, not because it is righteous, but because holiness, again, is being set apart. And we set apart the season culturally because we want to embrace the things that matter. And consumerism has gotten in the way of that. Consumerism has taken over that and put pressures on us that are unnecessary. But it's still a part of our cultural celebration. But it's set apart also for us as Christians in the sense that it is the season and the date and the time of the year that we remember Christ's incarnation and the majesty of God's love, that he would become human in order to redeem us. All right, food for thought. Christmas cookies for thought. Wait till you hear my thoughts on Halloween next year. I'm just kidding.
Oh, I'm with you on that. I don't.
And you know,
you know, this year's theme is a Dr. Seuss Christmas for decorating.
yeah, I know. I've thought about that. I think we need to win that at the church. Maybe that's what we should be winning.
No, then you go ahead and design it.
No, that's not. I'm not doing it. That's not my forte. Anyway, well, hopefully that was informative. Again, those books are not Christian books that I explored the history of Christmas with, and they're over here on my shelf. If you want to read about the history of Christmas and its sordid past, I don't think that its sordid past has to define our current Christmas, nor do I think the last 100 years have to define our Christmas. I think us as Christians needed to say what we want Christmas to be. And I think that we have control over that, and we can say, and I guess my encouragement before we look at the actual practical ways next week of how we might think about and celebrating Christmas and kind of in that framework that I just described, the question just becomes, is this a cultural celebration that I want to just live into its fullness? And here's a spiritual or religious celebration that I want to live into as well. And hopefully through the Advent Jesse Tree devotional that will be given out soon, that will be a way for you to begin that process of entering into what does the season of Advent mean? What does that mean for me as a Christian? And what does it mean for the 12 days of Christmas? How might we embrace that for the fullness of what it is and what it offers us as Christians? So,
Okay.
and with that in mind, let me close in prayer. God of the incarnation, we thank you that the majesty of your love is found in a baby in a manger. And although at times we have trivialized that over the years in our world and in our culture, we are reminded in this moment of how incredible that gift is. Today, as we depart from this conversation and this teaching, we ask that you might allow your Spirit to move in us and to prompt us to ask questions about what do we do in Christmas seasons or in holiday and holy seasons to honor you and to really recognize the grandeur of the incarnation in our lives. We offer this prayer in the name of your Son, Christ Jesus. And all God's children said,
Amen.
Amen.
Amen. All right.
All right.
Bye.
Bye,
Bye,
everybody.
everybody.
All right.
See you
Bye-bye.
tomorrow.